Welcome back to another ASCO Journal of Oncology Practice podcast. This is Dr. Bob Miller of the JOP editorial board and medical oncologist at Johns Hopkins. This is the second podcast covering the JOP special series, which was on electronic health records in oncology. This appeared in our July issue. For the first podcast, I interviewed Dr. Peter Yu regarding the central topic of meaningful use, which is how providers and hospitals can qualify for federal incentive dollars for electronic health record adoption and use. Now, I usually say this at the end of the podcast, but we encourage you to look at some of the other articles in the special series on electronic health records, which were in the July JOP. And to make that even more painless, I'm going to take a few minutes to summarize a few of the other manuscripts, so hopefully that will inspire you to pull out your issue and to take a look. The first article I'm going to cover is entitled Electronic Chemotherapy Order Entry, a Major Cancer Center's Implementation. First author was Nancy Sclaren. And this reports on the experience from Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Now, at Memorial, they used a phased approach to the implementation of electronic health records and computerized physician order entry, or CPOE, which started in about 2003. Their primary goals, of course, similar to everyone else, is first and foremost to improve patient safety throughout the chemotherapy ordering and delivery process. They were also looking for a system that was easier to use, and they were hoping to find something that would be accessible remotely for those prescribing or reviewing regimens from home, for example. The group used a multidisciplinary team approach for oversight. They developed order sets which were subdivided by the different malignancy-specific subject matter experts. They created a multidisciplinary group to provide input from both management and end users into design and workflow. And this consisted of medical oncologists, experienced verification nurses, chemotherapy pharmacists, treating nurses, and a variety of operational personnel. The team reported to the physician-in-chief in Memorial and the chair of the Department of Medicine. They decided to use a commercially available vendor product. And one of their goals was to try to mirror the paper order form, which was currently in use at Memorial. Secondarily, they wanted the orders to be flexible enough for on-site configuration. One of the highest priorities was to include clinical decision support, or CDS. And you can see in Table 2 in the manuscript some of the features that they incorporated into their chemotherapy CPOE. These included things such as predefined regimens and base doses, weight change alerts, restrictions of routes of administration and units for each drug, access to the pharmacy system to view prior dispensed doses, and also the ability to copy entire order sets forward to the next cycle without having to rewrite things, which I'm sure was very popular with many of the providers. Some of the key elements of their implementation plan was, first, that there was a clear mandate that only electronic orders would be accepted after the rollout, so no clinician could specifically opt out of use. Now, they used a sequential rollout by disease-specific service. You might have heard of the so-called Big Bang approach, where a facility goes live all at once with all providers, but they decided to move forward disease site by disease site. Of the lessons they learned, first, it was very important to closely collaborate with the vendor to create a customized and configurable order form with the type of functionality they were looking for. Second, and probably most importantly, they had to map their existing workflows in their clinics before the new process was actually started. So I think that's really the place to start for most centers. And finally, they recognized the importance of identifying a physician champion for each service, since they rolled out one service at a time. The second article I wanted to cover is entitled Computerized Provider Order Entry in Pediatric Oncology, Design, Implementation, and Outcomes. This is by Alan Chen and colleagues at Johns Hopkins Pediatric Oncology. Now, there's little question that pediatric oncology is one of the most challenging of the oncologic specialties, and this is, of course, for a number of reasons. As in all oncology patients, the medications used have a narrow therapeutic index, and there's a need to individualize treatment regimens not only by age, but in the case of pediatrics, by weight and by patient size. Furthermore, the majority of pediatric oncology patients are treated on cooperative clinical trials, which tend to be fairly complex, but each center tends to have low accrual per trial. Furthermore, there's the acceptance of grade 4 hematologic and mucosal toxicity in pediatrics, perhaps more so than for adult patients. So all of this serves to make pediatric oncology a particularly complex discipline for conversion to an electronic system. Now, prior to going live with a CPOE system at Johns Hopkins, they had already established a number of important safety principles. The most important, of course, is order clarity, so that the prescriber's intent is carried out. But of secondary importance is the process of independent checking, so that the ordering process can recover from any single human error. The Hopkins group initially used paper templates, but eventually they evolved to a homegrown order generation system, which was electronic, but it really wasn't a full-fledged CPOA system since it didn't have an interface with the pharmacy. So they made the decision, like Memorial, to use a vendor system. It's actually the same vendor system as Memorial. But they chose to enhance the safety and security by utilizing something the vendor supplied called MLMs, or medical logic modules. They used a total of 30 different pediatric oncology-specific MLM. Now, this included things like height and weight double-checking, dose adjustments, hydration orders. You can see in the online appendix to the article in JOP the full list of these MLMs and also some of the screenshots. Of note, in their practice, where they saw 172 new pediatric oncology cases per year, they had 79 active protocols. So, by definition, that means that there was very low accrual for any individual protocol. So rather than trying to create order sets for rarely used protocols, they decided to use a so-called just-in-time approach. And what that meant is that they had an institutional commitment to build, review, test, and approve an order set within 2 weeks from identifying an urgent patient need for a specific protocol. So their conclusions were that this CPOE system preserved some of their prior emphasis on order clarity and independent checks while enhancing the overall safety of the approach. Now, the third article I wanted to cover is entitled Creating a Process to Standardize Regimen Order Sets Within an Electronic Health Record. The first author is Leslie Busby, and this is from the U.S. Oncology Group. Of note, this is available online only, so if you go to this article on the JOP website, you will find the article and the appendices there. This article addresses the important issue of how to make sure that clinical data that's in an EHR, and in this case specifically chemotherapy order sets, are up to date. For U.S. Oncology, they use a single electronic health record at multiple sites across their network, so this is a fairly large task to keep the order sets up to date. Specifically, they have a regimen library, which is a repository of about 500 order sets. This is overseen by the Collaborative Care Committee, or CCC. The group is comprised of 8 physicians, 7 pharmacists, several nurses, and other administrative and support personnel. Now, this study had 2 parts. First, there was a utilization review of the frequency of use of their order sets between January and October in 2009. Second, there was an audit for the relevance and appropriateness of the order sets when compared with published regimens. What they found was that of 511 regimens, they were able to rename or consolidate about 51, so about 10%. They tried to be consistent with the naming of the regimens, and they favored the use of generic names for the drugs. But there were some exceptions. For example, the name Abraxane was retained instead of the generic name nab-paclitaxel to avoid confusion with paclitaxel. And certain acronyms were kept in place for well-known regimens such as RCHOP. So in Figure 1, you can see some of the changes that were made. One example is vinorelbine for breast cancer was changed from 30 milligrams per meter squared per week to 25 milligrams per meter squared per week, and so forth. Now, why is this important? Well, I think it highlights the fact that there is no single authoritative reference source for chemotherapy regimens. And in U.S. Oncology, the network physicians came to rely on the regimen library that their EHR provided. So it was very important to keep that up to date. It was also an opportunity to identify global issues. An example might be the fairly recent change in the dosing of carboplatin using AUC dosing, but incorporating specific dose caps per AUC. The next article I wanted to cover is entitled Outcomes of Computerized Physician Order Entry in an Electronic Health Record After Implementation in an Outpatient Oncology Setting. The first author is Kara Harshberger. And this is from the Kellogg Cancer Center, which is part of North Shore University Healthcare System, which is in the northern suburbs of Chicago. And this manuscript focused on documentation completeness of chemotherapy orders using CPOE. What they looked to do was to compare the completeness prior to implementation of CPOE and after they had become proficient in using CPOE. The authors also set out to assess user satisfaction with the CPOE system. They specifically focused on several widely used regimens. These included things such as FOLFOX, AC, ABVD, RCHOP, and so forth. And they looked at two time frames. First was when the paper orders were largely in use, which was 1999, and then after CPOE implementation, which was a 12-month period from 2005 through 2006. Also, they only looked at patients who had received at least 3 cycles of treatment, so the information was representative. They evaluated a number of chemotherapy data points, such as whether the medical record number was on the order, the number of cycles indicated, the BSA, the infusion length, various treatment parameters, and so forth. And the second part of their study was they did a provider satisfaction survey of physicians, nurses, and pharmacists using the system. This was a 13-question survey addressing such topics as chart availability, diagnosis, treatment plan, past medical history, and so forth. They reviewed a total of 90 charts, 45 from 1999, which were all on paper, and 45 from the second time period, which were all electronic. What they found, not surprisingly, was that there was a statistically significant increase in chart completeness after the implementation of the electronic system. So it went from about 67% to 93%. Some of the factors they were looking for are in Table 1 in the manuscript. For example, there was a statistically significant improvement in notation of BSA from 20% on paper to 96% electronically. Another example was infusion length being specifically noted, went from 56% to 100%. Another observation they made, which you can see in Figure 1 in the paper, is that the average rate of completeness didn't really vary much with the complexity of the regimen. For example, AC was not that different from FOLFOX, the latter being a somewhat more complex regimen. Now, as part of their staff satisfaction survey, of the 49 responses, they found pretty consistent increases in satisfaction with the implementation of the electronic system. This was across all user types, nurses, pharmacists, physicians. In the discussion section in this paper, they make a couple of additional interesting points. The first is that over time they configured their system to provide a one-page, quote, big picture report, which was a one-page summary of the most pertinent patient information. They configured it so that if a user wanted to look at more detailed information, this was hyperlinked so it would take them to the full flow sheet. They found that this probably improved patient safety because it was a reminder of all of the relevant information on one screen. A second enhancement was the use of the treatment note, and this is something that we actually use at my institution, but a treatment note is a physician document that outlines the physician's intent for the chemotherapy cycle. So it's a quick summary of what the treatment plan is and any changes to the plan as they occur over time, such as dose reductions, supportive medications, and so forth. This treatment note appeared at the top of their one-page big picture report, and that further enhanced communication. final article I wanted to cover is entitled, What Do People Affected by Cancer Think About Electronic Health Information Exchange? Results from the 2010 Livestrong Electronic Health Information Exchange Survey and the 2008 Health Information National Trends Survey. So this is not a paper that's strictly about electronic health records, but it deals with the important topic of electronic health information exchange. This is something that the HITECH Act, or the stimulus bill from 2009, is supposed to facilitate. This article looks specifically at patients' attitudes and preferences towards electronic health information exchange. This article is about two different surveys that were performed. The first was an electronic survey conducted by the Livestrong organization. An invitation was sent through email, Facebook, Twitter, and so forth, and ultimately over 8,400 patients completed the survey and were included in these results. The patients were subdivided into survivors who were on treatment, patients living with cancer as a chronic illness, post-treatment survivors, and people who had no personal history of cancer. A second survey was called the Health Information National Trends Survey, or the HINTS survey, and this is something that's conducted regularly by the National Cancer Institute that looks to assess the public's attitudes and knowledge regarding cancer prevention and control with an emphasis on health information technology. This survey was a combination of a telephone survey and a paper survey. Now, the Livestrong survey was focused on three specific areas: the perspectives on the importance of electronic health information exchange and its potential impact on the quality of care. The second was the respondents' willingness to share their electronic health data for the purposes of research. And the third was their preferences related to specific functional capabilities of electronic health records. Similarly, the HINTS survey measured respondents' willingness to share electronic health information for the purposes of research. So the findings were interesting because it showed pretty clearly that patients who were either living with cancer or were post-treatment cancer survivors had, as a very high priority, a desire that their healthcare providers share information with each other. For example, for patients living with cancer as a chronic illness or post-treatment survivors, they rated the statement, "It is very important that my healthcare provider be able to share my medical information with others electronically," as very important from 75% of the time to 82% of the time. This should be contrasted with the findings from the HINT survey of a more general adult population, so a non-cancer population of about 48%. Similarly, cancer patients and cancer survivors felt it very important that they be able to get copies of their own medical information electronically. This was rated as being very important, anywhere from 69% to 81%. Again, contrasted with the general adult population, where this was deemed to be very important at about 52%. Many survey respondents were also willing to share their anonymous health information for the purposes of research, but again, this varied between cancer patients and cancer survivors in the general population. For the general population, about 32% strongly agreed that scientists doing research should be able to review anonymized medical information, compared to anywhere from 55% to 70% for cancer patients or for cancer survivors. Another part of the Livestrong survey was an assessment of what patients were looking for in electronic health record functionality. A significant majority of the Livestrong respondents rated as being very important that electronic health records be private, secure, and confidential. Also, most Livestrong survey respondents wanted the ability to enter their own reports of their physical health into an electronic health record. In the discussion section, the authors note, quote, "This desire to improve coordination of care may reflect a more realistic view of technology as facilitator and not a barrier in meeting personal health goals and gaining an appreciation of the complexity of cancer care." Now, I don't know if this question was actually asked on the survey, but I think it would be very interesting to see how patients would weigh the relative importance of making protected health information more widely available for care coordination versus what that did to the risks to security and privacy, since unfortunately In many cases, at least with current technology, increasing availability of electronic information decreases the safety and security of the information. So I don't know if that question was asked in the survey, but I think that would be an interesting follow-up. Well, since I can hear the catchy JOP podcast theme music in the background, I'll wind this up and remind you to send comments on our podcast to jopeditorsdesk@asco.org or comment in iTunes. We'll be back in a few weeks with a couple of podcasts from the September JOP issue, which includes a special State of Oncology Practice series. This is Dr. Bob Miller for the American Society of Clinical Oncology. Thanks very much for listening.